Hello, class and professor. It's actually going to be really nice hearing y'all's voices for a change. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. But so the book, The Destroyer of the Gods, it talks about how Christianity was really different from the beliefs and the customs of the Roman world. Larry Hurtado, he looks at the history that explains Christianity, how it introduced these new ideas. For one, a God that loves and forgives, or a faith that's based on a book, or even like a special way of living with these really high moral standards. And these ideas, they were just really different from the people in Rome. It's really different from the ideas that they were used to. I think that the overall strength of the book, I would say, is that he presents really strong and interesting evidence to show how Christianity was unique in those early years. The details, they're not just some random details that he throws out there, but the main points he lays out really shows the distinctions. The book wasn't boring, it wasn't dry. One weakness I would say, I know this might seem like a little shallow, but a weakness in my opinion is that the chapters could have been a little bit shorter, and probably with the inclusion of more chapters. That's just the kind of book that I like to read. And I wish that the notes that were included after he quoted the authors and such, I wish that they were included in the footnote section of each page of the book, as opposed to it being in the very back, which I just don't like. But as for the content, it really wasn't a book that really changed my life, so to speak, but it was good, and I would recommend it for anyone. But the chapter that I wanted to discuss was chapter 3, which is the new identity. Back in the Roman times, people were actually born into certain towns and families, and they had their own gods and traditions. So from the moment that they were born, and this part was interesting to me, but when they were born, gods were assigned to them. Kind of a little bit like how being Jewish is both a religion and a part of someone's ethnicity or identity. In the Roman world, it wasn't just something religion wasn't just something that they chose, it was something they were born into. Every town, family, the ethnic groups, they had their own gods and traditions, and these were core parts of the people's identity, is what the author was trying to say. But Christians had a hard time living among these people and worshiping a different God. From birth, people were expected to honor these gods and their families and communities. It wasn't just a personal belief, it was a social duty. The gods they were tied to, it was tied to every part of their life, from the public celebrations, household rituals. The Romans, they believed that their well-being, even the whole success of the empire, it all depended on keeping the gods happy. So we see this struggle in the Bible, which Paul talks about, when he mentions eating meat offered to idols. There were disagreements within the churches. Paul had to help them figure out how to cope with this. In the book of Revelation, John talks about someone he calls Jezebel, who was leading people to eat food that was offered to the idols, which did things against God's ways. So this is why Christianity was so shocking to the Romans, because when they became Christians, they weren't just following a new God, they were rejecting all the other gods that they had been born into, and it was kind of seen as a betrayal of their family and even their civic duty, the Roman Empire. So it's part of why Christians faced a lot of resistance and persecution. But one thing that the author, he does really well, I think, is he shows just how deeply religion was part of the Roman life. It wasn't just what they believed, again, it was a part of who they were from birth. So I think that he really helps us picture what it was like for Christians to live in this world, and how hard it was for them to make choices about what they could and couldn't do. One of the best things about this chapter is how he explains what life was really like in the Roman times. He doesn't just give the facts, but he actually helps us visualize it. Almost like we're watching a movie. You can really just imagine how big of a deal it was to be a Christian. To leave those old gods behind. And I would say that another strength is how he shows how religion wasn't just something they did; it was part of who they were. So from the moment that they were born their gods were chosen for them, and he makes this really clear, so that we can understand why the Romans were so confused. They were really even upset, when Christians said, "Oh, we follow Jesus now." He also does a great job, I would say, of explaining why Christianity was different from all the other religions at the time. Back then, again, you were born into your religions, but Christians, they had to make a choice. So that was kind of unheard of. He makes us think about how brave these first Christians, had to be. And I would also say that probably another strength of the chapter is that because it's full of details that make the history feel real. He doesn't just tell us what happened, he helps us picture it again, which is why being a Christian in ancient Rome wasn't easy, but it was a powerful thing to do. So when someone became a Christian and got baptized, for example, they were choosing to leave these old gods behind and take on a new identity in Jesus. This was a really big deal, and he explains how this change looked to the Romans, who saw religion as a part of everyday life. He really helps us understand, just how much courage it took to become a Christian. Now, one thing that might be a weakness, that might be a little tough about this chapter, is that the author, he gives a lot of details, and sometimes it feels like it's just a little too much information. It can be hard to keep track of things. So if you're not used to reading about ancient history, or if you're not interested in that stuff, it might take you some time to really understand all the connections that he's trying to make. But anyways, another thing is that he does an awesome job explaining how religion was part of the Roman identity, but I would say that he doesn't spend as much time talking about how it felt for an everyday people. Like, we learn a lot about the big picture of how these things look to the overall society, but it would have been interesting to kind of hear more stories about what it was like for just a normal, regular, random Roman citizen, how they saw it when someone became a Christian. I wonder if there was any primary sources that talked about this. So the chapter, I would say that this chapter in the whole book is valuable because it helps us understand the world in the New Testament and what it was like to be a Christian back then. And when we read the Bible, we see a lot of places where Paul and other writers, where they talk about idols, false gods, the pressure to fit in with the Roman society. But he helps us see why this was such a big deal. And he explains things like in Roman times, it wasn't just something that people believed, that was part of their identities. So when someone became a Christian, they weren't just changing their beliefs, they were stepping away from their whole way of life. This helps us kind of understand why early Christians faced so much pressure and persecution. And he also, I would say this chapter is also valuable because parts of the Bible, like 1 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10, and parts of Revelation, he makes them easier to understand, because when Paul talks about eating food offered to idols, or when John talks about that Jezebel that I had mentioned earlier, for Christians not to do those things, we realize that it wasn't just about food. It's not just some weird statement we read about in the Bible, but it was about more. It was about their loyalty. What gods do they serve? So were these new Christians going to keep following Jesus, or were they going to go back to their old ways of life? So the chapter, it helps us kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the early Christians and see how big and scary their decisions really were. It reminds us that following Jesus, it's not always easy, but it is always worth it. So that's it, guys. That's my video. Thanks for listening, and I hope that I can see you guys in another class.